On episode 170 of the 40 Plus Fitness podcast, we'll learn what's up with wheat when we talk to nutritionist Cindi O'Meara. The show notes for this episode can be found at 40plusfitnesspodcast.com/170. Have you decided you're ready to make a change? To reclaim your health and fitness? The 40 Plus Fitness podcast is here for you. I'm your host, Alan Meisner. I'm an NSAM certified personal trainer with a specialization in corrective exercise and fitness nutrition. Let me be your coach as you find your way on your health and fitness journey. All right, let's go. If you haven't signed up yet for the November Squat Challenge, there's still a few days. October 29th is the last day to join hundreds of your fellow listeners as we squat our way through November. Go to 40plusfitnesspodcast.com/squat and sign up today. Cindi O'Meara, in her quest to regain her health, came to a stark reality. Wheat was killing her, along with much of the Western world. In the documentary, What's with Wheat, she explains what has happened to wheat and why you might need to pass on the bread at your next meal. So Cindi, welcome to 40 Plus Fitness.
Thanks, Alan. It's good to be here.
I was watching your documentary, and as I was kind of getting into it, I've read a lot of books on this stuff and this content, and the leaky gut and all the aspects of what wheat does to us. And as I was kind of thinking through all the books that I've kind of read on it, because there are more and more of them coming out as the science is really kind of showing us the effect that wheat can have on most of us if we get into that bad range with it. But anyway, I just really appreciated the people you had on there, kind of how the information was presented. And I guess it's information dense, but it's entertaining to watch, if that makes sense to you. It just really was well done. And I really just appreciated the effort and time that it took to make something that had that much science behind it, had those professionals engaged in that project, and again, was just very well put together.
Thank you. I appreciate it. And I actually really enjoyed doing it. And for me, it was a process of aha moments, I guess, and learning and education. And it was why I picked these professionals was that for nearly 3 to 4 years before I even decided to do the documentary, I was learning from them and learning big time from them as they were learning. Because this is something that should not be happening. We should not be having an intolerance to a food that we have eaten for thousands and thousands of years. So I felt it was really important for people to understand why we are now having this issue with wheat.
Exactly. And I think that's one of the things is, I think someone had put it one time is eat food your grandmother would recognize. And a lot of the great grandmother, I do. And I have, and I would say, they made biscuits and gravy. They ate a lot of the things that I eat, but my reaction to that food is very different than it was when they were cooking it for me. But what I really want to start this with is because you kind of got this, I guess for lack of a better word, bear in your craw because of things you were going through. And so could you kind of tell us a little bit about your story and then kind of how this all evolved for you?
Yeah, I think it's important for people to realize that from a family that has died young, I don't have the greatest of genetic potentials. So my mother was one of 11, the oldest, and she would have been 79 if she's still alive today. And most of that family is dead through hemophilia, through age, through liver problems, cancers, breast cancer. It just wasn't a great start. And so in a 12-month period, I lost my grandmother, my mother, and my sister to autoimmune disease, lung cancer, and stroke. And thinking about that, their eras that they lived in. So my grandma was in her 90s, my mother was in her 60s, and my sister was in their 40s. And for me, it has always been about how can I improve my genetic potential so I don't end up on the scrap heap, which is what happened to many of my relatives. So I have always eaten well all my life. I have been interested in food. I've eaten everything from scratch. I don't take antibiotics. I don't take painkillers. I don't take any medications. I'm not a heavy drinker. I don't smoke. I have a good time, by the way. Don't let anybody think I don't have a good time. But that was the way I had lived my life. And then I'm getting into my late 40s, and many people would blame going into menopause or something like that, especially if you're a female. But I wasn't going to take that. But what was happening when I was getting into my late 40s is I had a very sore back, and I'd had it for about 18 months. I had got right hip pain so bad that when I get up after sitting, my thoughts were, am I going to need a hip transplant? This is just, or replacement. This is what I was beginning to think. I was getting anxiety at 3 a.m, and it was just stupid anxiety, it felt like. I had aches and pains. I was putting on weight, and my brain wasn't working as well as it could be. And that was like over an 18-month period. I just didn't know what was happening. And I thought, well, obviously, being a nutritionist, obviously it's something that I'm consuming. So I did an elimination protocol, and I did it for 3 weeks, not 6, which is what I recommend now, but I did it for 3 weeks. And I would say within 7 days, I had lost 4.5 kilos. Now, to me, that's not fat. Had to be water weight, because you don't lose 4.5 kilos of fat in a week period. If you look at how much the body can use over a period of time, it's around 350 grams a day. So my backache left me. I had, on about the 10th day, this mind-blowing clarity that I'd never experienced before in my brain. It was my girlfriends thought I was on drugs. I was like going, but don't you see this? Can't you? It was weird. But anyway, that was what was happening in my body and in my brain. It was a complete revolution. And then by the end of the 3 weeks, I'd lost 9 kilos of weight. All aches and pains had disappeared. Had unbelievable energy, clarity of mind. It was quite an amazing experience. And then I started to introduce the foods back into my diet, because I can't live on the very small amount of food that I was consuming. I introduced it back into my diet, and wheat was my biggest problem. I ate wheat, and the next day I weighed myself. I had gained 700 grams of weight, which is, almost a litre of water, because it couldn't have been fat. I had a sore back and all of my troubles came back within 24 hours. So I decided that I didn't want that, and I eliminated wheat completely. But being a nutritionist, I was not happy with that, just knowing that I couldn't eat wheat. Why did somebody who had looked after herself all her life, all of a sudden in the late ages of 40, heading into 50, have a problem with wheat? And so I went on a bit of a research, and Wheat Belly came out a year later, and a year later Grain Brain came out, and I found another book by 2 chiropractors in the US that was, I think it was Lose the Grain, Lose the Wheat, and something about the brain. I can't remember the exact name of it. So there was other people realizing this same information, and that was my experience.
So just to recap a little bit about this, is that an elimination diet is basically where you remove certain foods. And for most people that do this, they're going to remove dairy, they're going to remove legumes, they're going to remove nuts, they're going to remove grains. They may remove nightshades like tomatoes and peppers. How far along did you remove all of those, or just some of those?
Well, what I did was, so my whole basis of nutrition was based on when I went to the University of Colorado in Boulder and did pre-med, and one of the subjects that I did was cultural anthropology and anthropology. And that got my interest in nutrition, was that we had survived as humans and evolved as humans because of the food that we consumed. So I kind of thought, if I go back to the basics and back to the winter foods of the hunter-gatherer, so not even paleo, but really looking at what was it that our hunter-gatherers would do on a 12-month basis, and how would they detox from heavy metals? And the heavy metals would have been around because there were volcanoes erupting and all sorts of things. So I kind of went back to the winter foods of the hunter-gatherer, which means there wasn't a lot of food around. The meat was lean. The vegetables were probably greenery if I could get it. And if there were some winter fruits, then they would have been available. And so small amounts of food, only greens, only small bits of meat and those winter fruits, but not a lot of winter fruit. There wouldn't have been a lot available. So that was it. It was a very, very basic diet. It was low in energy, but it was remarkable how it allowed me to remove, obviously, fat over a period of time, because what happened is that I started to use the fat that I had gained over that 2 years in order to survive. And I never got hungry. That was the amazing thing, is I was never hungry, because I did it through a phase system where I now have created this program called the 4-phase fat elimination protocol. And there are 4 phases in it where we mimic certain times of the year for the hunter-gatherer in order to get our evolutionary bodies to do what they should be doing on a seasonal basis or on a yearly basis.
Okay. So it sounds like you got yourself into ketosis or very close to ketosis for most of that time while you were on this 3-week elimination diet.
But I didn't want to eat but what I was doing was I wasn't eating the fat that I was burning.
I understand that, but I think that's kind of the point, is you were still fueling your brain and your body with fat. It just happened to be your fat, which you at that point felt like you had plenty to dispose of for that purpose. Okay. Now, when we think about wheat, and I think this is where people, this is one of the things that is really difficult, because when people say, okay, well, eliminate all the white stuff, and people are like, well, okay, but all of Europe lives on potatoes and all of Asia lives on rice. And of course, all of the rest of us, we live on bread and grains. And so wheat particularly, played a very important role in why we actually have civilization, why we have the population growth that we've had, and literally why we are, who we are. Can you kind of give us a little bit of the history, not too deep, but just enough to understand, where the cultivation of grain, the history of it, and then, kind of how it helped us do those things?
So as hunter-gatherers, we were always nomads. And when we were able to cultivate the land, then we were able to not be nomads anymore, but create villages. And so it was the result of doing this and the food being available to us and knowing how to store food that took us from hunter-gatherer to agriculturalist. And it's the belief that it was agriculture that created the civilizations that we see today, by staying in one place and not having to eat 24 hours a day because we were either catching food or looking for food, or we had it all available to us. So that was how agriculture started. And if we have a look at the Australian Aboriginal, there's a belief that they have been agriculturalists for at least 60,000 years. And that is a new thing that's just coming out now, that we realize they manipulated the land and they grew a lot of the grain that they consumed here in Australia that was very much isolated from the Northern Hemisphere. So what was happening in the Northern Hemisphere was also happening in the Southern Hemisphere. So we actually know that this made civilization possible, and that's what we talk about in the film. And so why does something that created this whole amazing world that we see today now something that seems to be poisonous for many people in the world?
Yeah, and that's kind of the I guess the meat of the question is, what's with wheat? Why is wheat now not good for us?
And I think we explored that, and we went back to 1920s where we realized that it was the beginning of shelf-stable foods, which was breakfast cereals. That was the first shelf-stable foods that we ever got. Dr. Kellogg's was very much a part of that. And then because there was a notice that there were certain vitamins and minerals that were missing in the population because we had pellagra and beriberi and deficiencies in vitamins and minerals, we started to fortify those foods and our flours. So the fortification was one of the first things that happened, and it wasn't fortified with vitamins and minerals that we extracted from other foods. It was fortified from foods that were or minerals that were mined from the ground, or vitamins that were made in a chemical laboratory. And we know that B1 is made from the paper pulp industry. We know that vitamin A is made from acetone. We actually can go back and see how these vitamins and minerals are being produced. And as Dr. Stephanie Seneff says in the documentary, is that everything's in context. We shouldn't be taking a vitamin or a mineral out and then putting it back into a food, because we refined the grain as well. We took the germ out and we took the bran out. And then there was Ansel Keys. Ansel Keys said fat's bad for us. And so there was this whole revolution that happened where people stopped eating fat and we started to eat more carbohydrates, and wheat being a very cheap commodity and used in breads and pastas and muffins and cakes and everything, it started to be used more and more, and we started to consume more and more. And then there was, in the 70s, there was the the hybridization of the wheat by a gentleman by the name of Norman Borlaug, the beginning of the Green Revolution, which was actually not green. It was all about chemicals. So then that was the beginning of monocultures and chemicals being sprayed on our food supply. And here we are, we're only in the 70s and 80s. And if you go back where I was born in 1960, and if you go back to the 60s and 70s, and my mum being an American, we had apple pie. She made all of our breads. You know, wheat was a very big part of our diet, but I didn't know anybody that had wheat intolerances back then. So it was like what happened was somewhere in the 80s and 90s. So it was the hybridization of that wheat grain, the introduction of chemicals and more chemicals being sprayed on them, and the fact that we started to eat less and less of every other food. And then not only were we eating more of our wheat, and in many different ways and in many different forms, and in forms we didn't even know were, and the chemicals that were being sprayed on that wheat we were also consuming, which was then destroying our ability to eat this wheat that we were eating more and more of. And as we pull all of these facts together, we realize a perfect storm has been created, that we now see links that wheat has with autoimmune diseases, an increase in celiac disease, an increase in wheat allergy, as well as a new disease called non-celiac gluten sensitivity, which can portray itself in the body anywhere. Could be in your joints, it could be in your brain, it could be the fact that you're putting on weight, it could be migraines, and there's so many ways that we're now seeing these maladies that we're now seeing is linked back to what was once something that was the stuff of life, and that's wheat.
And, and I guess another thing that came out of the video, the documentary that was kind of news to me, was how a lot of the byproducts from this whole refining of wheat, then, again, no one wants to leave anything wasted in industry, but they're using those chemicals that they're pulling off of the wheat, and they're using them in other things like our shampoos and our cosmetics and things like that again it's just additional exposure to a potential toxin once our body has lost tolerance to it. Now we're applying it to not just our stomach and our gut, we're now applying it to our skin and our hair, which again is just adding to that exposure.
And then people who are taking vitamins and minerals don't realize that sometimes wheat is an excipient within those vitamins and minerals. There are medications for autoimmune diseases that has wheat as an excipient or a filler.
That's a selling product. I mean, here's a product that's going to get you sick, but are you buying it to keep you from getting sick for the thing that's getting you sick?
Exactly.
That's an awesome sales proposition when you think about it. It's like, wow, it's so good it's evil.
Yeah, exactly. But I think the knowledge of what's happening is growing, and as a result, then I'm hoping that any vitamins and minerals or medications that have wheat in it, that will stop. But the problem is that people don't realize that ascorbic acid is made from wheat. So they get the wheat grain, they convert it to glucose, then through a few fermentation steps, it becomes ascorbic acid. Now, that's not vitamin C. It's just ascorbic acid. And ascorbic acid means ascorbic, prevents scurvy. Vitamin C is a completely different molecule. It has other things that are with the ascorbic acid. And once upon a time, it used to be called hexaronic acid. It's just that when they realized that was the component that stopped scurvy, it became a huge commodity. Another thing is that people don't realize that wheat is basically indoors. It was really funny. I was talking about this the other day, and somebody said, I'm going to have to ask for a gluten-free room when I go to a hotel. Like in Australia, we have this company called Stramit, and Stramit is where the ceilings lined with wheat as insulation. So it's, and because we're becoming more and more sensitive to this, and because the chemicals that are sprayed on the wheat, and more particularly than any other chemical, is glyphosate or Roundup, which we're now finding in traces of gelatin, because animals eat these foods that have got Roundup or glyphosate in it. We're finding in gelatin, we're finding them in bones. So if you're making bone broths to heal your gut, be very, very careful about what bones you're using. So this is what's happening, is that we're not only eating lots, but we're destroying our ability, which is the glyphosate, as well as foods that we consume, as well as antibiotics, that is killing our microbiome, and therefore we're not able to digest it.
And it's kind of funny. I mean, obviously, I've given up grains for the most part. I very seldom go back to eating them because I just feel better when I'm not. But we've moved our dogs to grain free, and we have a German Shepherd, and she's not she hurt her knee when she was younger, so she just has this hesitancy to really do a lot. She's very just lay around and not do much. But she's a wonderful dog, but she she was overweight and a little chunky. So we moved to this grain-free food, and she dropped 20% of her weight in weeks, just like it was nothing. And now her knee doesn't hurt her nearly as bad, which was, again, the problem. She was struggling with her knee and probably arthritis in that knee. And just getting her off of grains has meant a whole difference in who she is as a dog. And I know it's the same for us.
Yeah, and with the animal feeds, it's a cheap filler. That's what it is. It's just a cheap filler. Animals don't eat grains. They, especially our dogs, they will eat, if you look at, I'm always looking at what did we do in the wild, because that's how we evolved to be where we are today. And what we've done is we've dismissed all our culture, our tradition, what we did in the wild, how we lived our lives. We've dismissed all of that, and we're living these modern lives that are creating problems. So what I do when I'm looking at what I'm going to feed my dog or my animals, I think, well, what do they do in the wild? How do they exist? And if they are going to eat any grain or vegetables, it will be in the gastrointestinal tract of the animal that they've killed. And it will have probably fermented, or, the vegetables will be half cooked in there. But their main thing is that, they're consuming a lot of meat. And it's interesting that you should bring up animal feeds, because when I was looking for a really good animal feed for my dog, I decided to look at dried ingredient foods. And I looked at the one that was worth $140 for a big bag versus the one that was worth $30 for a big bag. And all I did was read the ingredients, and they were identical. It was just how they were marketed. And they just had grain in it, mainly grain. It was just a marketing ploy. And that's when I flipped my lid and went, right, that's it. I'm just going to buy kangaroo because we have lots of kangaroos here. And I'm sorry if anybody's scared that or upset that we eat Skippy, but
no, I'm sorry. A kangaroo's delicious. Every time I go back to Australia, I'm eating some kangaroo and ostrich if I can find it. A good kangaroo steak is something you need to try. So, obviously, when you tell someone that they should give up grains, and that's their knees will probably feel better, they won't be as bloated, and they'll think with a lot more clarity. They're still in grain brain at that point. They get this terrified look on their face, like, you're going to take away what? And so, how do we convince people? How does someone convince themselves that this is something they just need to do?
I love how you're asking me this, because it floors me that people would rather be in pain than give up their bread. For me, it was so dramatic, and I love feeling good, and I'm just not prepared to feel bad. But let me give you an example. I have a beautiful friend who's a medical doctor, very intelligent. He has an autoimmune disease, and while I got him off diet drinks, for some reason, I cannot get him to even try the elimination to see how he will feel in a period of time. So
you're going to have to kidnap him for 3 weeks.
Oh my gosh. I look at him. I've got medical doctor friends, and they've all got autoimmune diseases, and none of them listen to me. So I just find what happens is that if you're open to suggestion and you're sick of living with your disability, no matter what it is, whether it's a migraine. And I think I need to tell you this story as well, because this showed me even more so the absolute power of an elimination diet. So 2 years after I'd done my elimination diet, I was still having some niggling problems, and one of them was regular migraines. So I decided I'm going to do it again. I'm going to figure out what is happening here. So I did that whole 4-phase fat elimination protocol again. And for 2 weeks, I lost no weight because I didn't have a lot of weight to lose. And on the third week, after my body just said, well, there's nothing else I can do here. I'm going to have to eliminate that fat, that last 3 kilos that's sitting there, because that's what I lost in a week. I lost 3 kilos of weight, which for any Americans that are listening to this, that's
almost 7 pounds. Yeah.
Yeah, 7 pounds. So I lost that in a week, but I also had severe migraines for 5 days, absolutely in bed for 2 days. 3 days I could get out of bed. And from that day on, I have never had another migraine. And that was 3 years ago. So what was happening at this point, and I think this is really important for people to realize, is that your body will only release the fat that it can release as it needs to release it. And I think that last 3 kilos of fat was very toxic, and I'd probably had it sitting in there for quite some time. And when I gave it no other choice but to release it, it had to release it despite it making me feel very, very ill and sick. And a lot of people say, oh, that elimination diet made me sick. Well, what's happening is that your body is finally releasing, toxicity. And I think this needs to be done in a time-honored manner. And if we have a look at history, we realize that throughout the history of evolution, we have had in the summer lots and lots of food, saturated fat, lots of sugar, lots of carbs. Everything was available to us. We'd gain weight. And then the winter came and less foods were available to us. And so we would use the fat that we had gained to eliminate, to live. And if there was any toxicity in that fat, that would be eliminated. And we would do this on a 12-monthly cycle. So I feel that, when you go on an elimination, some people actually feel worse, but that's your body trying to release. So I'm very much into, don't do this in a screaming hurry. Take your time. Make sure you do this properly. Eliminate the foods that are needed to be eliminated. Then test and measure how you go. And then go through the process again. And it could be that it takes you a couple of years to get well and to have all these things happen. I feel that I had lived a fairly clean life, and I got away with that elimination very, very well. But I do see that people do struggle sometimes on these eliminations, and they will believe that the elimination has made them more sensitive to foods. But all it does is make this quite obvious what's wrong and what's happening, and gives you that feeling of well-being that you didn't know that you could have even had. And Dr. Sarah Ballantyne says that very well. She says we're so used to feeling bad and having medications and having all of these issues that nobody knows what it's like to feel good anymore. And I think that's the essence of this whole, how do you get people to eliminate and then remain off this for years and years and years and years. And I think it's about showing them how good they can feel, and then them making the obvious choice for themselves.
Yeah. And a lot of what you were probably going through, our bodies, our liver and our bodies are really, really smart in saying if we have toxins, the liver's got to deal with them. But if we're building body fat, if we're adding body fat, that's a perfect disposal place for that toxin, because then the liver doesn't have to worry about it at that point. So it kind of clears path for the liver to be a little bit healthier at that point in time. Now, obviously, as we're losing that body fat, those toxins are coming back to bear. And so that's kind of that point, I think, where your body was saying, this is probably our most toxic area that's getting released. And, just that accumulation that had been there, because that was all the body fat you had at that point, that you could give up, then at that point, it just happened to have a density of toxins that would be a little bit more than what you were going through. But I do think that's important for folks to understand, is that it's the journey to getting well. And so, in taking an elimination diet like this, what you're really doing is you're saying, I'm going to force my body to get well through this exercise, and then I'm going to learn a whole lot about me and my body as I start to reintroduce these foods one at a time, because that does give us that opportunity to say, if I reintroduce legumes, how does my body react? If I reintroduce dairy products, how does my body react? And as you do those one at a time, it really does give you that data, that self-experiment, to really understand what foods are good for you and which ones you just really should avoid.
Absolutely perfectly said.
So now, again, I love the documentary. I really did. And I appreciate the people that you had on there. If I could personally thank all of them, I would as well. They really gave it all. They put it together in a very clear way. And I'm actually kind of floored at the depth that you guys covered in that documentary. It really was, from A to Z, on what we know from science and what we know from history as far as our food and how wheat could be adversely affecting our health. And so again, I just thank you so much for putting this together. If someone wanted to get in touch with you or learn more about the documentary, What's with Wheat, where would you have me send them?
Well, they can go to what'swithwheat.com. That's all about the documentary. Or they can go to my company is Changing Habits, and it's called changinghabits.com.au. And the documentary is on that platform as well as everything else that we do, including the 4-phase fat elimination protocol. And we have an organic food place now, or not a place, but distribution center, because I wrote the book Changing Habits, Changing Lives. And that was back in 1998. And people would say to me, where do you get this food you're talking about? How do I source it? How do I trust the company? And so my husband and I started to source the food for ourselves in our pantry, and then we just shared it with our community. So people will see that there's a vast array of information, recipes, foods, protocols, programs, and documentary, What's with Wheat, which is our latest project.
That's awesome. So thank you, Cindi. I really do appreciate having you on today. For those links and whatnot, you can go to 40plusfitnesspodcast.com/170. So again, thank you, Cindi. I appreciate having you on.
Thanks, Alan.
Sorry to bother you about this again, but I just have to have you with us for the 30-day squat challenge. Sign up ends October 29th. Go to 40plusfitnesspodcast.com/squat. There's 3 different levels, so even if you're just a very, very beginning person, there's going to be a level for you. There's level for people who are quite advanced. I'm going to be doing the advanced version. I hope you will join me. I really do want to have you on the squat challenge. Let's do something crazy in November. It's going to be amazing. Next time on the 40 Plus Fitness Podcast, we'll meet Lucy Wyndham Reed, the author of Walk Off the Weight. Until then, have a happy and healthy day.